One of the things that my work has been about, and what I think, in fact, all intellectual work should be about, is the crossing of thresholds, making permeable the sometimes impermeable, the so-called ivory tower in particular. And as we all crossed a threshold to come here tonight, entered into the airlock of climate control, which our winters oblige us to create. This is a mostly unconscious achievement that each of us performs many times in a given day. What I want to talk about tonight in part is the function of thresholds, how thresholds work, and to try to motivate some ideas about the relationship between consciousness and the city. Now, one of the oldest jokes in philosophy is that there's a map of the university campus, and on the map is a sign that says Institute for Philosophy, and there is an arrow pointing to a dot, and it says, "Why are you here?" Instead of "you are here." See, that's a good laugh for a philosophy joke. That's about as much as it deserves. Philosophers tend to focus on the why of that question, why are you here? I want to focus on how the here relates to the why, which is to say, why are you here? Why are you someplace in particular? A lot of philosophical reflection tends to move towards a kind of disembodied or abstracted state, and even in political theory, tends to think about the possibilities of citizenship or the political sphere, the public sphere, as somehow immaterial or dematerialized. And so part of what this work is about is an attempt, following on the insights of certain people like Hannah Arendt and Walter Benjamin, to rematerialize the political. And perhaps as a result, not only get each one of us to think about our homes, our streets, our cities differently, more consciously than we do as we cross thresholds every day, but also to try to bring together some of the political thinking characteristic of citizenship and the thinking that goes into the creation of built forms, streets, waterfront developments. I was told I had to mention that. So that these actual material things should be informed always by a political consciousness and vice versa. So to that end, what I'm going to do is show you a series of images and unpack some features of consciousness in the city. I'm going to focus on three specific cities, two that are discussed in the book, New York and Shanghai, and then I'm going to finish with some thoughts about Canadian cities, and in particular Toronto, where I'm from, but also other Canadian cities. What you can see here, first of all, in this image, this is the cover image of the Canadian edition of the book. It was interesting that the American and British editions refused to use this cover. Partly this is just a matter of principle. Editors in New York and London just say, whatever you did in Toronto isn't good enough for us. But this, I think, is a beautiful image and speaks closely, immediately, to the heart of the matter. It's a photograph of one of the Ville Nouvelle developments in the banlieue of Paris by the Canadian photographer Geoffrey James. And some of you may know his work. The Lethbridge Project in particular is a beautiful series of documented photographs of Lethbridge. But he's also worked in Paris and elsewhere in the tradition of Bresson and Atget and other masters of silver gelatin. And what you see here, what I like about this is you see a combination of these kind of neo-Romanesque rounded arch forms, which are not really arches, they're not supporting anything, and this sort of space-age Jetson-style doodad, which is festooning the top of these columns. But what I particularly like is the way this creates a kind of doorway within, a kind of doorway for giants within the larger development. And Geoffrey is very effective in keeping the human figure within the frame, but putting it into a somewhat secondary or even marginalized space. And I think this photograph does that. So the richness of its beauty also brings out some of these features. Just a word about the title, Concrete Reveries. The book begins where I think it should begin, with a consideration of concrete as a material. Concrete is perhaps the material that most of us most love to hate. Despite that, it is the second most consumed substance on the planet after water. So despite the fact that we hate it, we produce huge amounts of it and deploy huge amounts of it constantly. And as I'm sure many of you know, some of the concrete which is extant on the planet is now itself toxic. So we've got concrete as a building material, infinitely flexible, spongiform, and at the same time life-threatening. And so this duality of the material itself, the forms in which it's been dominantly structured tend to be the slab, the brutalist slab. One of the things I wanted to do just as a keynote in these thoughts was get us to rethink concrete as a material, see that it might be a beautiful material. But concrete is, in addition to being a noun, an adjective. And so it is used here. And as a philosopher, I'm familiar with the complaint, usually, that whatever it is I'm up to isn't concrete. So I wanted to say, well, look, it's right there in the title, so it must be. But I wanted, of course, to destabilize it with the noun that is modified by concrete, reveries, which is a lovely word. Daydream, I think, is the closest analog for me. A reverie is not just a dream, a sleeping dream, but it's a way your mind wanders off when you're lost in a reverie. And what I am constantly preoccupied by in thinking about consciousness in the city is the way the city gives us opportunities to wander in that way. Much of the way we use our cities is directed use, directed circulation and transaction. And as Benjamin himself reminds us, one of the greatest gifts a city can bestow on you is to allow you to get lost in it. And so this idea of getting lost is ever in the back of reverie. But the celebration of the flaneur, which is the sort of aestheticized version of the urban wanderer you find in the Arcades project, very much belongs to a different era, to a kind of high modern era. And so I think we have to, in a way, the task is to think about how we can wander in our cities in new ways. There are lots of metaphors that we can use to think about cities. Why think about them at all? Well, the answer to that is materially obvious. For the first time in human history, more people on the planet live in cities than don't. And so the great progression of urbanization, which has been going on since at least the 1300s, has now tipped over into its larger point and is likely to continue. In addition to that, the 20 largest cities on Earth, the ones that are 15 to 25 million inhabitants or more, are in the developing world, not in the so-called first world. And so these massive conurbations are really machines on one metaphorical view, which we simply don't understand very well. To try to understand them, we can use various other metaphors. Are cities living things? Are they transactional nodes? Are they circulation systems? All of these metaphors and more, I think, need to be brought to bear on our understanding of cities.